Sherlock Holmes, The Creature in the Coal Tunnels. Chapter 1. The Ward at St. Mary's. I had not thought of Rhys Morgan in 11 years, and then a boy from St. Mary's Hospital put a note into my hand at 9:30 on a wet evening, and the name came back whole. I had set his wrist once, in my old surgery near the Paddington Road, for 2 shillings he could barely afford, and a bag of pears he insisted I take besides. He had gone home to Wales not long after, back to his father's pit, and I had never expected to hear of him again. The note said he was crushed under a fall of stone, that his shoulder was ruined, and that he had asked for me by name. I found him in a narrow bed, at the end of a long ward, his right arm strapped tight across his chest, his face the colour of tallow. He did not know me. His eyes were open and fixed on the ceiling, and his lips moved without stopping. 4 and 3, he said. 4 and 3. 4 and 3. I asked the sister how long he had been like this. She said the morphia did it to some men. It loosened whatever they carried and let it out in pieces. I sat by him a while, more from old fondness than from any medical purpose, and I confess the numbers began to work on me too. 4 knocks. A pause. 3 knocks. Over and over. The same measure. Like a man keeping time on a drum he could not stop playing. I had soldiered in Afghanistan, and a man does not forget a signal, once his life has hung on reading one correctly. This was not the babble of fever. It had a shape to it, deliberate and exact, the kind of rhythm a man drills into his hand until it no longer needs his mind at all. I took out my notebook and I wrote it down, tap for tap, as a nurse might chart a pulse. 4 and 3, Morgan said again, and then, quite clearly, don't let them wall it up again. That sentence stopped my pencil. Everything else might have been the wandering of a hurt mind. That sentence was not wandering. It had an object in it, and a fear behind the object, and I have found in 30 years of medicine that fear is nearly always about something real. I went back at 9 the next morning, when the morphia had worn thin and Morgan was more himself, though grey with pain. He knew me at once, and something like pleasure crossed his face before the pain settled over it again. "Dr. Watson," he said, "they told me you came. I am glad of it, though I hardly know why I asked for you above any other man in London." We talked of small things first, his father, his shoulder, the mine. I did not mean to raise the other matter so soon, but it came out of me before I had decided to speak. "You spoke a good deal in your sleep last night, Morgan." "Numbers, mostly. 4 and 3, over and over." His face changed the way a room changes when a lamp is put out. He looked at the window, not at me, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. "I don't recall dreaming," he said at last. "You spoke of a wall, too. Something about not letting them wall it up again." "I've no notion what you mean, sir." His voice had gone flat, careful, the voice of a man reciting a lesson. It was the morphia talking, I expect. It does strange things to a man. I let it go. I am a doctor before I am anything else, and a frightened patient is not helped by being pressed. But I have set enough bones and heard enough men lie to their own wives about how badly they were hurt to know a false calm when I hear one. And Morgan's calm was as false as a stage moon. He would not speak of it sober, and that, I thought, told me a good deal more than the raving had. It was, I believe, a Tuesday when the hospital's note reached me. Though writing this some years on, I find I cannot swear to it. My pocketbook from that week is long lost, and only the numbers themselves have stayed sharp in my memory, worn smooth by so much handling since. Small matters slip, that one does not. I visited him 3 or 4 times in the week that followed, as a friend rather than as his physician, for St. Mary's had good men enough for the shoulder. Each time I found him a little stronger in body and a little more shut in spirit. Once I asked him outright who they might be, and he turned his face to the wall and asked me, quite gently, to let an old friend alone. I did let him alone, on the surface, but I kept my notebook, and most evenings before I went to bed, I took it out and looked again at that patient hammering rhythm. 4 strokes and 3, and wondered what a man could be signalling, and to whom, that he dared not name it, even to a friend from London. Chapter 2. The Numbers in the Notebook. It was the autumn of 1890, and a doctor learns patience before he learns anything else worth knowing, so I did not go rushing off to Wales on the strength of a sick man's mutterings. I did what any sensible investigator does with a fact he does not understand. I went looking for more facts to set beside it. The newspapers of 3 years back are not hard to find if a man has the time and a patient clerk at the British Museum reading room to fetch them. I found what I was looking for under the date of the 14th of October, 1887, a fall at the Garth colliery, in the valley the Welsh call Kumgarth, had taken 11 men in a single afternoon. The report was brief and the tone of it careful. The kind of carefulness that comes from lawyers reading a document before it is printed. Faulty timber was blamed, in a sentence so short it might have been apologizing for itself. The report gave the dead by name, a labourer's age set against each, and at the foot of the column a line about a memorial service at Saw Chapel, where, the paper said, the bell had been rung once for every man lost, 11 strokes, slow, with the whole valley standing bareheaded in the rain to count them. I do not know why that detail stayed with me above the others, but it did, and I found myself, on the train 2 days later, counting an imagined bell without meaning to, the way a tune will fix itself in a man's head against his will. One further name, in a later paragraph, caught my eye and would not let go of it. The colliery's own surveyor, a Mr. Idris Vaughan, had left his post a month before the disaster and had not been heard of since. The company's statement called it an unexplained absence. I read that twice, and then a third time, and I thought of a man in a hospital bed telling me, in his sleep, not to let them wall it up again. I am not a man who leaps to conclusions from a single coincidence, and I want that understood before I go further. For what follows will show a great deal of leaping on my part before Sherlock Holmes ever entered this business and set it right. But a surveyor gone missing a month before a fall, that timber failure explained badly, and a collier 3 years later raving in a rhythm and begging that something not be sealed up again, these two facts sat side by side in my mind and refused to be parted. I had thought, more than once, of laying the matter before Holmes at the very start. But a doctor's fancy about a morphia dream is a thin thing to carry into Baker Street, and I did not care to be laughed at, even kindly, for chasing numbers a sick man muttered in his sleep. Better, I thought, to go and stand on solid ground first, to see the pit and hear the valley's own account of itself, before I asked my friend to take an old soldier's hunch on trust. I would go as Morgan's friend, not as anybody's detective, and if I found nothing, no one but myself would ever know I had gone at all. My practice ran light through that autumn, and I had a young locum, keen and honest, who was glad of the extra work and the extra fee. I told him I had a friend to visit in the west of England, which was true enough as far as it went, and on a grey Thursday morning I took the express from Paddington for South Wales, with my notebook in my breast pocket and no very clear idea of what I meant to do when I arrived. The train left a little after 8, and by the time the houses of London had thinned into fields, I had read my own notes through so many times that the pencil had begun to smear. 4 and 3, 4 and 3. I put the book away at last and watched the country go by, green giving slowly over to grey stone and grey chapel and grey sky, until somewhere past Newport the valleys began, and with them the black tips of coal that told me I was near the place where Rees Morgan's trouble, whatever it was, had its root. I shared my compartment for the last hour with an elderly minister travelling to a funeral in Merthyr, a mild, talkative man who asked where I was bound and, on hearing Blaengarth, gave a small sigh that told me more than he perhaps intended. "A sad valley just now," he said. "A good chapel, mind, and good people." But a valley does not forget 11 men in 3 years, doctor, whatever the company would like. Some griefs want burying twice. I asked him what he meant by that, but he only shook his head and said he had said more than a stranger deserved already, and turned to his window and did not speak again until Merthyr, where he wished me well and was gone into the rain. Chapter 3. The Valley of Kumgarth. Blaengarth is a small place, one street of grey houses climbing the side of a valley so steep that a man leaving his own front door must decide at once whether he is going up or down, for there is no going level. The colliery sits at the bottom, black against the green hill, and above it, the wheel that turns the winding gear never seemed to stop, not once in the 3 days I stayed there. I took a room above the ironmonger's, kept by a widow named Mrs. Pugh, a small brisk woman who fed me better than my London landlady ever had, and asked me no questions I did not want answered, which I have always thought the mark of a truly excellent landlady. On my first evening she asked, in the way of small talk, what brought a London doctor to Blaengarth, and I said, truthfully enough, that I had a patient's people to look up. Would that be the Morgans then? She said, not as a question. Rhys is a good boy. His mother has not slept right since he was hurt, though I think it is more than the shoulder keeps her from her bed. I asked what she meant, and she looked at me a moment before answering, the way a person looks who is deciding whether a stranger can be trusted with a local trouble. It is the old number 3 heading, she said at last. Sealed, these 3 years, since the fall. The men will not work within 200 yards of it on the night shift, not for triple pay, and Josiah Price himself cannot make them, for all he tries. They say the knockers have started up again. I asked her, as gently as I could manage, what the knockers were, though I had heard the word once or twice from Cornish miners in my army days, and had a rough idea. The old people's spirits, she said. Every pit has them, so they say, small folk that live in the coal, and warn a man when the roof is bad, if he is decent to them, and knock for the dead if he is not. My own grandfather swore he heard 3 knocks before the 1861 explosion at Kumgarth, 3 knocks and no more, and 30 men dead by morning. She crossed herself, which surprised me a little in a chapel town, an old habit outliving the faith that should have buried it. But this is different, they say. This is not 3 knocks and done. This goes on and on, a whole night sometimes, the same beat over and over, and young Rhys swears he raised his lamp to the old heading door one night and saw something pale go crawling back from the light of it, low to the ground, like a great white slug, God between us and all harm. I confess a small chill went through me at that, doctor and soldier though I am, for there is something in a shared fear, calmly told by a sensible woman over a supper table, that no ghost story read alone by a fire can match. But I am not a man for spirits, and I said as much, and asked instead whether anyone had thought to open the old heading and see what was there. Mr. Price says it is not safe. Bad air, he says, and the roof gone soft. He has had the mining inspector down twice, and both times the report says the same, seal it and leave it be. She shook her head. It is a hard thing, when a man's own dead will not lie quiet, to be told by his betters that it is only bad air. I asked her whether the knocking followed any pattern that she knew of, half expecting her to say no, that fear does not count so carefully. She surprised me. Old Rhys's boy, the one that saw the pale thing, he counted it once for a wager with the other boys. 4, he said, and then 3, and then the same again, all night, until his father fetched him home by the ear for standing near the place at all. She looked at me sharply. You've gone pale yourself, doctor. Is it a thing you've heard before? I told her I had not, which was a lie, the first of several small ones this business would draw out of me before it was done, and went up to my room with my head full of a number I had thought belonged only to a hospital bed 300 miles away. The next morning I walked down toward the colliery, meaning only to look at the place from a respectful distance, and found my way instead to Saw Chapel and its graveyard, where a long, low stone, newer than its neighbours, carried 11 names in 2 columns. I was reading them and thinking of the bell that had rung once for each, when a man's voice spoke close behind me and made me start. "You'll be the London doctor," he said. He was perhaps 40, though grief or work had aged him past it. A tall, gaunt man in a deacon's black coat, his hands raw and chapped in a way that spoke of more than Sunday duties. "Evan Ellis. My brother is overman at the Garth." We talked a little of Morgan, whom he knew slightly, and of the 11 names on the stone, 2 of whom, he told me quietly, had been friends of his youth. There was a stillness about him that I put down, at the time, to a naturally solemn character, the sort of man Chapel produces in every Welsh valley. It was only later, a great deal later, that I understood the stillness was the stillness of a man holding something very heavy, very carefully, for fear of what would happen if he let it slip. As I turned to go, he caught my sleeve, lightly, and asked whether I meant to write anything of my visit, for the newspapers or for the company. I told him I was no journalist, only a doctor with a patient to think of. "Then I will ask you a kindness, doctor, from one who has never asked you for anything before and may never ask again." His voice had dropped almost to nothing. "Whatever you hear in this valley, of knockers or of anything else, let it lie. There are men here trying to do right in circumstances not of their making, and a stranger stirring the water can drown someone who never asked to be swimming in it." It was an odd, urgent little speech from a man I had known 10 minutes. I put it down, foolishly, to a Chapel man's dislike of gossip, carried out of the valley, to be mocked in London parlours, and I gave him my word, and meant it kindly. It was a small promise, made to a stranger, on a Chapel path. It cost us a day, later on, and I will come to how. That afternoon I wrote to the locum in London, asking for 2 days more, and went to find whoever at the Garth colliery might let a curious visitor down the shaft. I told myself I only wanted to see the place with my own eyes before I went home and put the whole matter down as an old soldier's fancy over a sick man's dream. I did not then expect to hear, with my own 2 ears, 200 yards of solid stone away, the same 4 strokes and 3 that Rhys Morgan had beaten out on a Paddington bed a week before, inspired by the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Chapter 4. 200 yards of stone. The Garth colliery kept a lamproom at the pithead, where a man drew his light against a numbered token, and it was here, waiting my turn in a queue of blackened men going on to the day shift, that I first laid eyes on the ledger that would matter so much to Sherlock Holmes a fortnight later, though I understood nothing of its importance then. I noticed only, idling with a doctor's habit of noticing small things, that the clerk's count did not seem to balance. He counted his stubs of candle against the tokens twice, frowning, before he let the matter go with a shrug, as a man does over a discrepancy too small to chase. I thought nothing more of it. I have set that scene down here exactly as I remember it, because it is one of the 2 things I got right that morning, though I would not have believed it if a wiser man had told me so at the time. Isaac Ellis, the overman, was a broad, careful man who agreed to take me down more from respect for a doctor's coat than from any liking for visitors. He asked, once we were in the cage and dropping through darkness lit only by our 2 lights, whether I had come about the knocking, and when I said I had heard something of it, his face closed like a door. "Settling stone," he said. "The old heading is unsound. Men will make ghost stories of a creaking timber if you let them, doctor, and I've enough to do keeping the roof up without arguing with spirits." He said it too quickly, and too often, in the short walk we made along the main road, before he left me in the care of a boy to bring me back up, and a man who has cross-examined a good many nervous patients learns to know the difference between a fact stated once and a fact recited. I asked the boy, whose name was Di Rees, and who could not have been more than 14, whether he might take me within sight of the sealed heading, and offered him a shilling for his trouble, which settled the matter at once. He was a sharp, quick-eyed lad, and as we walked he told me, unprompted, that he had seen the pale thing himself, that it had gone low and fast the moment his light touched it, and that his father had beaten him for going near the place a second time rather than for lying about the first. "I did not lie, sir," he said, with the fierce dignity of a boy who has been called a liar once too often. "I saw what I saw. I told him I believed him, which was truer than he knew, for I had already begun to suspect that whatever he had seen was neither imagination nor spirit, but something a good deal more solid and a good deal more desperate." We walked perhaps a quarter-mile along a low, dripping road, our lights throwing small yellow rooms around us that the darkness closed up again the moment we passed. The air grew close and warm. Somewhere ahead, water dripped in a slow, patient rhythm of its own, and under that, so faint at first I thought I imagined it, I began to hear the other sound. 4 strokes. A pause exactly as long as the 4 strokes together. 3 strokes. Silence. Longer again, and then the whole pattern once more, as steady as a clock, and I thought even then, a good deal more deliberate than any clock I had ever heard. Di Reese would go no closer, and I did not press the boy. I stood alone in that low black road, 200 yards of solid rock between myself and whatever made that sound, and I counted the pattern through perhaps 20 repetitions, my old soldier's ear certain now of what my doctor's reason still fought against. Rock does not knock in 4s and 3s. Water does not pause the same length each time. This was a hand, or something very like a hand, and it was tiring, for toward the last few repetitions the strokes came slower and less even, the way a signalman's arm will drop when he has been sending too long without answer. I went back up that cage with my mind working faster than it had in years. Here was my theory, and I set it down honestly, false as it proved. I believed some man had survived the fall of 1887, sheltered by chance in an air pocket. The collapse had left him, and had lived alone in the dark these 3 years on whatever the old workings could give him, his reason worn thin by solitude, until only this single stubborn signal remained of the man he had been. It fit the fear I had seen in Morgan's face, and it fit, well enough, the company's wish to call the whole business settling stone rather than admit to a horror they could not explain. It fit everything, I believed, except one detail I did not yet possess, and would not possess until a friend of mine, a fortnight later, asked me a single question about mortar that pulled my whole neat theory down like a house of cards. I did not go down again. Ellis had made plain enough, without quite saying so, that a second visit would not be welcome, and I did not think Mrs. Pugh's kindness would survive too many questions about a subject the whole valley seemed to want left alone. I spent my last evening in Blaengarth writing up my notebook as carefully as I have ever written anything, the knock pattern, the lamp room's uncertain count, Evan Ellis's strange plea, Mrs. Pugh's story of the pale crawling shape Di Reese swore he had seen. I did not know what I had, only that I had a great deal more than I had come with, and that it was now too large a thing for me to carry alone any further. I took the morning train home and went that same evening, still travel-stained, to Baker Street, resolved at last to lay the whole business before the one man in London whose mind might make sense of what mine could only gather. Chapter 5. Baker Street hears it. I found Holmes in his dressing gown at 9 in the evening, a chemical retort bubbling gently at his elbow and a violin lying, for once untouched, across the arm of his chair. He looked up as I came in, travel-stained and, I dare say, wearing my whole fortnight on my face, and set down his pipette at once. "You have been to South Wales, Watson, and you have not slept properly in some days, and whatever it is has to do with sound rather than sight, for you keep tilting your head as a man does who is still listening for something." He waved me to a chair. "Sit down and tell it properly, from the beginning, and leave nothing out because you think it foolish." I have built more cases on a fact a client thought too small to mention than on any deduction of my own. I told him everything. Morgan's ravings, the numbers, his fear when sober, the newspaper account of the fall, Evan Ellis's odd plea by the chapel wall, Mrs. Pugh's story of the knockers and the pale crawling shape, the lamproom's ledger that would not balance, and last of all, what I had heard with my own ears, 200 yards down a dripping road in the dark. I gave him the pattern exactly as I had recorded it. 4 strokes, a pause, 3 strokes, over and over. Holmes had listened without once interrupting, his eyes half closed, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. When I had finished, he sat silent a moment longer, and then he did something that surprised me a good deal, for it was not his habit to praise a thing before he had picked it fully apart. "You wrote the pattern down at once, before you had any theory to fit it to," he said. "That is the whole difference, Watson, between a witness and a man who merely remembers. Most men, hearing a strange thing, spend their first minute inventing an explanation and only their second minute noticing the fact itself, by which time the fact has usually been bent to fit the explanation. You gave me the raw number before you gave me your fright. It is worth more to me than anything else you have told me tonight, and I do not say that to spare your feelings. I confess I was absurdly pleased, and said something about it being no more than any soldier learns to do with a signal he cannot yet read." Holmes waved this aside, not unkindly, and asked me for the theory I had, in the end, allowed myself. I told him of the survivor, alone 3 years in the dark, his reason worn down to a single stubborn signal. Holmes shook his head slowly, before I had even finished the sentence. "No," he said, "it is a natural theory, and a kind one, and it is wrong, and I can show you why without leaving this chair. You tell me the lamproom clerk's count would not balance, a small excess of candle stubs against no working shift. Consider what that means, Watson. If your man down there were truly forgotten, sealed in by chance and unknown to any living soul, who is drawing extra candles for him? A ghost does not need light. A forgotten man starves in silence, and no ledger anywhere notices his absence, because no one is keeping his account. But someone at that colliery is keeping his account, Watson, every week, deliberately, and covering the gap so neatly that only a doctor's idle habit of watching a clerk count twice caught it at all. Your survivor is not forgotten. He is guarded and fed and kept quiet by someone who knows precisely what he is and precisely why he must never be found." I sat back, feeling rather as though the floor of the case had opened beneath me. Then who? That I cannot yet tell you with certainty. But I recall a name from an idle hour some years ago, when a colliery insurer asked me privately whether a certain timber report from a South Wales pit could be trusted, in a matter touching a different claim entirely. I gave my opinion and thought no more of it, but the name of the pit was Garth, and the report I distrusted was thin, where a competent survey ought to have been thick. I filed the impression away, as one does, and forgot it until tonight, when you gave me a surveyor's name and a month of vanishing that fit that thin report a good deal too well to be chance. He rose and reached for his coat. "We shall want the earliest train in the morning, Watson, and you shall want your revolver, though I hope very much we shall not need it. There are 2 questions I mean to put to that valley the moment we arrive. Who brings the food, and who dated the seal? Answer those honestly, and I do not think this case will trouble us very long. What you have recorded, in your own plain hand, is nothing more mysterious than pit code, Watson. We have only to learn who is speaking it, and to whom." We took the 7 o'clock express from Paddington, and Holmes ate nothing the whole journey beyond 2 cups of black coffee, a habit of his I had long ago stopped remarking upon. He thought better hungry, he always said, and a full stomach was an enemy to a clear head, though I noticed he made no such objection to tobacco, and filled the compartment with a fog from his oldest and foulest pipe, until the guard, passing along the corridor, put his head in twice to ask, with great and visible restraint, whether all was well. He questioned me closely on every detail I had gathered, turning each one over as a jeweller turns a stone, holding it to different lights. Evan Ellis's plea interested him more than I had expected. A man does not beg a stranger, on 10 minutes' acquaintance, to let a matter of ghosts and settling stone lie undisturbed, he said, watching the fields go by. He begs when the truth, once disturbed, will fall on someone he loves. Remember that, Watson, when we meet him again. He is not our enemy in this, whatever else he may prove to be. I asked what he meant by that, and he only smiled, in the dry way he had that was not quite a smile at all, and said I would see for myself soon enough, and that a detective who told a friend everything he suspected before the facts had confirmed it was no better than a fortune-teller at a fair. We reached Kumgarth as the light was failing, the black wheel over the pit head turning against a sky gone the colour of a healing bruise, and I confess my heart beat a good deal faster walking that one steep street a second time, now that I no longer walked it alone. Chapter 6. The overman's brother Holmes did not go near the colliery that first evening, to my surprise, but sat instead with Mrs. Pugh over a late supper and drew out of her, with a gentleness I had not always credited him with, the whole valley's account of itself, who owned what, who owed what, who had buried a son in the '87 fall and who had not. He asked twice about Evan Ellis, and both times Mrs. Pugh's answer was the same. A good man, chapel to his bones, gone grey before his time. No wife, no child, only his brother Isaac, and his conscience for company. There is a man carrying something, Holmes said to me afterward, as we sat by the small fire in my old room above the ironmonger's. I knew it, the moment you described his manner by the chapel wall. A guilty man defends himself. A man carrying another's guilt for love of him defends everyone but himself, and grows thin doing it. We will call on Mr. Ellis in the morning, and you will let me do most of the talking, Watson, for I think he trusts you a little, and trust is a fragile thing to spend carelessly. We went first, before that call, to the small office at the pit head where the candles were kept and counted, and Holmes spent the better part of an hour with the ledger I had glanced at once and thought nothing of. He ran his finger down column after column, murmuring dates under his breath, and at last set the book down with the satisfied air of a man who has found exactly what he expected to find, and no more. 61 draws of candle in excess of the working roster over the past 18 months, he said. Never more than one at a time, never on a Sunday, and every single one entered against the name of Evan Ellis, drawn on his own shift and carried away in his own pocket, if the clerk's memory of him is to be trusted, which I think it is. A man who wished to steal candles for himself would not be so careful to take only one at a time, nor so careful to skip the Sabbath. That is not theft, Watson. That is a man keeping a promise to someone, on every day but the one his own faith forbids him to break it. We found Evan Ellis an hour later, mending a stretch of dry stone wall above the chapel, with the slow, careful patience of a man glad of something for his hands to do. He straightened when he saw me, and the small warmth that had been in his face for a moment died the instant his eyes moved to Holmes beside me. Holmes introduced himself plainly, as a friend of Dr. Watson's with an interest in the old No. 3 heading, and his manner changed at once from the mild curiosity he had used on Mrs. Pugh to something sharper, quicker, a series of small questions fired one after another before the man had properly gathered his wits to answer the first. You were at the lamp room on Thursday last? I was. And Tuesday before that? I don't recall. You recall Thursday well enough. Why not Tuesday? Ellis said nothing to that, and Holmes let the silence sit a moment before he tried a different door. How long has that coat hung on the peg by your door, Mr. Ellis? It is a good coat, better than a working man buys twice in a lifetime. Sunday coat, I should think, and yet you wear it of a Thursday, mending a wall no chapel elder asked you to mend. "A man may wear his own coat when he pleases," Ellis said, low and strained. "He may," Holmes agreed, and let the matter drop as suddenly as he had raised it, though I saw his eyes go once, briefly, to the man's cuff, and stay there a fraction of a second longer than idle interest required. He said nothing more of it to me at the time, and it was only very much later, when the whole truth stood plain before us, that he told me he had seen that morning a fine pale dust along the cuff, a dust that had no business on any man's sleeve in a valley of grey shale and black coal, and had kept the observation to himself, for he was not yet certain what it meant, and did not care to send me chasing a half-formed idea. Holmes asked, in the mildest voice imaginable, whether Mr. Ellis could tell him anything of the knocking the valley had been hearing. Ellis said what he had said to me on the chapel path, that it was settling stone and old grief working on frightened minds, and said it in the same flat, careful voice I remembered, though I saw now, watching for it, how much the saying cost him. It was on the walk back that the trouble between Holmes and myself, small as it was, came to a head. He asked me directly whether I had spoken with Ellis before that morning, and something in his tone, some faint edge of a man who already half suspects the answer, made me hesitate before I told him of our meeting by the chapel wall and of the promise I had given. "You gave your word to a stranger on a graveyard path that you would let this matter lie," Holmes said when I had finished, and though his voice stayed, even I heard the disappointment under it plainly enough. "And you have carried that word for a fortnight without once telling me, though you have told me every other thing that happened to you in this valley, down to the colour of Mrs. Pugh's tablecloth." I said, with more heat than I meant, that Evan Ellis had struck me as an innocent man frightened by other men's crimes, and that I had not seen the harm in a small kindness to someone already so plainly suffering. "There may be no harm in it yet," Holmes said more gently, "but you have shown him, Watson, without meaning to, that you are the sort of man who keeps a promise even when it costs him. He will remember that when he hears we have spent the whole morning together in his chapel, examining his ledger and asking his neighbours what manner of man he is. A frightened man, watching a promise kept, is still a frightened man, and fear does not reason well about who its friends are." We lost, in the end, very nearly a full day over it, for Holmes would not move against Isaac Ellis or the colliery owner until he had satisfied himself, through a quiet word with the mining inspector's own office in Cardiff, of exactly when that heading had last been officially examined and sealed, and he would not send that word by wire from a valley so small that the telegraph clerk was cousin to half of it. He rode down to Cardiff himself that afternoon, and did not return until the last train, and I spent those hours alone with a growing, formless unease I could not then have named. It was during those lost hours, as we later learned, that word reached Evan Ellis of a London gentleman asking sharp questions about his coat and his Thursdays, and Ellis, in a panic I could not find it in myself to judge too harshly, did not go down with his candle that night at all. We did not know it then, but Idris Vaughan, whoever and wherever he truly was, spent that whole night without a fresh light, in the dark, with no way of knowing why the small kindness that had kept him sane for a year and a half had suddenly stopped. When I think of it now, I am glad we did not know, for I do not think either of us could have slept, and there was still, that night, a great deal of work left to do before we could put it right. Chapter 7. The Seals Mortar. The Mining Inspectorate's Cardiff office kept, as such offices generally do, a great deal more paper than sense, but among the paper Holmes found what he wanted. The company's own plans of the Garth workings, filed and dated at the time of the '87 inquiry, showing the old No. 3 heading sealed that same December, within 8 weeks of the fall, for the safety of persons and the prevention of further loss. In the dry language, such documents favour. He brought a copy back with him on the last train, and read it aloud to me by candlelight in Mrs. Pugh's small parlour, tracing the drawing with one long finger. A seal made in December of '87 would be old work now, he said. Mortar of that age, in a damp working, takes on a particular grey and crumbles a particular way when you press a thumbnail to it. I should like very much to press my thumbnail to that seal, Watson, before I say another word to anyone in this valley. He asked me, too, before we slept, exactly what Josiah Price was like to look at and to speak to, for he had not yet laid eyes on the man, and I told him what little I knew from Mrs. Pugh's account. A heavy, prosperous man, chapel on Sundays like everyone else in the valley, generous with the collection plate and careful with everything else. A man who had built the colliery school with one hand and closed the old sick fund with the other when the coal price fell. A man who wishes to be thought good, Holmes said, half to himself, and has found it cheaper, more than once, to purchase the appearance than the fact. We shall see. We went down that same evening, with Isaac Ellis's grudging permission bought by a fee large enough to still his questions, and stood at last before the heading itself, a rough stone wall, chest high and shoulder wide, mortared into the passage where the old road narrowed. Holmes held his lamp close and worked his thumbnail along a seam near the base, and I watched his face change in that small yellow light from patient interest to something harder and colder. "Not 3 years old," he said quietly. "Not even 2. This mortar is soft still, under the surface skin of it, the way new work stays soft for the better part of 2 years, in ground as wet as this. Someone rebuilt this seal, Watson, long after the company's own plans say it was first made, and rebuilt it well enough that a passing inspector, looking for exactly what the report told him to expect, would never think to press his thumb to it as I have just pressed mine." He straightened, and for the first time since I had known him in this business, I saw something close to anger in him, banked low and controlled. But there. 18 months, he said. Very close to 18 months, by the feel of it, which agrees exactly with your lamproom ledger. Whoever built this wall built it new, a year and a half ago, around a living man, and has been feeding him through some narrow way ever since, too narrow for a body to pass, but wide enough for a candle and a crust. He put his ear, for a long moment, close against the stone, and I saw his jaw tighten at whatever he heard there, though when he straightened again, his voice was perfectly level. "There is nothing tonight, Watson. No knocking at all. He is very weak, I should think, weaker than he has been any night since this wall went up, if he has strength left to strike it at all." I asked him then the question that had sat unspoken between us since Baker Street. "You believe it is Idris Vaughan." "I know it is Idris Vaughan," Holmes said. "I have known it since you first gave me his name and his month of vanishing, back in London, though I wanted the mortar under my own thumb before I said so aloud. A surveyor missing a month before a fall his own report would have prevented, if any company officer had troubled to read it. Consider the knock itself, Watson, 4 strokes and 3, which puzzled you as sound, and puzzled me not at all as a signal, once I set myself to the puzzling. Down a working pit, when a voice will not carry, the old hands still send letters by count, splitting the alphabet into 5 blocks of 5, and striking twice over, once for the block and once for the place within it. 4 and 3, sent again and again, spells nothing more nor less than 2 letters, struck out by a man with nothing left to him but his own initials and the strength, some nights, to tap them. I.V. Idris Vaughan has been signing his own name to that stone for a year and a half, Watson, and no one troubled to spell it out until a frightened patient of yours began doing it in his sleep, 300 miles away, for a doctor with a soldier's ear. There remained the question of what to do, and it was not so simple as walking to Josiah Price's door and accusing him, for Holmes was certain, and said so plainly, that a cornered man with 3 years of silence to protect might do in an hour of panic what he had lacked the stomach to do in 18 months of slow cruelty. Evan Ellis's missed night had very likely already been noticed and remarked upon by his brother, and a frightened overman, once he suspected the game was nearly up, was as dangerous as any owner. We went that night to the small police house at the foot of the valley. where a Sergeant Probert, a solid, unhurried man, who had clearly not expected his evening to include a consulting detective from London, heard Holmes out with growing stillness, and, to his credit, asked only sensible questions once he had finished being astonished. He knew Isaac Ellis a little, and Josiah Price rather better, having once summoned the latter over a dispute about a right-of-way, and I confess I warmed to the man for the plain, unimpressed way he took in a story that would have sent a less steady officer running for a superior to share the blame with. "We'll want the night shift," he said, after a while. "Strong men, and used to breaking stone quick and clean. I can have Isaac Ellis's own gang down there by 2 in the morning, if you can tell me plainly enough what we're breaking through for I'll not ask good colliers to open a wall on a ghost story, Mr. Holmes, whatever London may think of country policemen." Holmes told him plainly enough, and Probert's broad face went first pale, and then, slowly, very hard indeed. He sent a boy running at once for the colliery's own blacksmith and 2 of the strongest hewers on the night roster, with instructions to say nothing to Isaac Ellis of why they were wanted, only that Sergeant Probert required them at the pit head within the hour, on police business, and would explain when they arrived. I sent, too, a wire to St. Mary's Hospital, more from an old friend's instinct than any clear plan, and had word back before midnight that Rhys Morgan, healing well and restless in his ward, had discharged himself against advice 3 days before and was already on his way home to Kumgarth, drawn, I think, by whatever half-memory of that night's raving still worked in him, though he could not have said in words what pulled him. He arrived, as it happened, on the very last train that would reach the valley before morning, and walked into the colliery yard just as the first grey light was coming up over the tip, his arm still strapped, his face white with more than travel, in time to see the thing done that his own broken sleep had begun. Chapter 8. The night shift goes down. 4 men went down with picks and a crowbar a little after 2 in the morning, 2 hewers whose names I never properly learned, Sergeant Probert and Isaac Ellis himself, roused from his bed by a constable with orders so plainly stated that even a guilty man could find no honest way to refuse them without confessing his guilt by the refusal alone. Holmes and I went with them, each carrying his own light, and Rhys Morgan, against every piece of medical advice I could give him, would not be left behind, and stood at last in that low black road, with his good arm braced against the wall, his face turned toward the sealed heading like a man listening for his own name. The knock had stopped an hour before we arrived. I will not pretend that silence did not frighten me more than the sound ever had. The 2 hewers broke the seal at its base, where the mortar Holmes had tested still held its 1.5 years of dampness, and it came away faster than any of us expected, whole courses of stone dropping in grey lumps onto the tunnel floor. Isaac Ellis stood a little apart the whole time, the light shaking slightly in his hand, and said nothing at all, which was, I think, the most honest thing he did that night. When the gap was wide enough, Holmes went through first, on his hands and knees, with his own light held low, and I heard him say, in a voice I had never heard him use before, gentle almost past recognizing as his, "It is quite over now. You may stop striking, we have heard you." We found Idris Vaughan lying against the far wall of a chamber, no larger than a small room, thin past anything I have seen in a living man, his beard grown to his chest, his eyes shut against even the small light we carried. He was alive. He was, when Holmes's hand found his wrist, very weakly and very stubbornly alive, and there was, tucked inside his shirt against his ribs, in an oilskin gone soft, with years of his own warmth, a folded sheaf of paper that I would learn within the hour was the very survey report the whole valley's tragedy had turned upon. We carried him up between us, Holmes and one of the hewers bearing most of his weight, for he could not stand, and I went ahead with my bag, clearing a place at the pit head office, sending for Morgan's own mother's shawl to serve as a blanket, and had a spoonful of brandy and water past the man's lips, before ever Sergeant Probert had finished reading Isaac Ellis his rights. "It is the one piece of that whole strange night I am content to set down without false modesty, for it was work I knew how to do, and I did it well." It was full dawn by the time Josiah Price arrived, summoned from his own bed by a constable, and plainly expecting some quite different trouble. And it was in the pit head yard, in front of Price, Isaac Ellis under arrest, Sergeant Probert, myself, and Rees Morgan standing white and silent by the wall, that Holmes gave the explanation the whole valley had earned. "Mr. Vaughan surveyed your props in the autumn of '87, Mr. Price, and found what any honest surveyor would have found, that you had bought cheap timber and reported sound timber, to save yourself perhaps £30 against a risk you never expected to see realized. He wrote it down, as his duty required, and brought it to you a month before that report would have gone to the inspectorate." Holmes's voice had none of its usual quickness now. It moved slow and even, the voice of a man laying out facts in the order they had happened, for an audience that needed to understand every one of them. "You and your overman took him instead of his report to the inspectorate, and kept him hidden through some rougher arrangement those first months, while the fall you had made inevitable happened exactly as he had warned you it would, and killed 11 men whose names are cut into your own chapel wall. When the inquiry closed, and the valley's grief had quieted enough that you judged it safe, you built him a more lasting silence. 18 months ago, in the old number 3 heading, sealed fresh behind mortar, dated falsely to December of '87 on your own company plans. Where he was kept, those first months, I cannot tell you, and I do not think it greatly matters now. You could not bring yourselves to finish what you had begun, that much at least I will allow you, though it does you very little credit, for it left a living man in the dark for a year and a half, rather than sparing him a quicker end." Price said nothing. His face had gone the colour of the mortar itself. "Sergeant, you will find," Holmes went on, "that Isaac Ellis's brother has been drawing candles against no roster for 18 months, every week but the Sabbath, and carrying them down himself, which is the only decent thing done by any man in this business besides the 2 hewers who broke that wall an hour ago." He turned then unexpectedly to me. "Watson found that ledger discrepancy himself on his first morning in this valley, before ever I set foot here, and it was that small, patient piece of noticing that told me, in Baker Street, a fortnight ago, that no accident had made this silence but a deliberate hand. Tell them what you saw, Watson." "You earned the telling of it." I told them, as plainly as I could, of the clerk counting his stubs twice, and the small imbalance he had let go with a shrug, and I confess my voice was not entirely steady doing it, for I had not expected, in a colliery yard at dawn, to be handed the one piece of glory that whole strange business allowed me. Evan Ellis came down the yard path as I finished speaking, drawn by the noise and the lights and the crowd, and stopped dead at the sight of his brother in a constable's grip. He did not run, and he did not deny anything. He knelt down, instead, in the mud of the yard, and told Sergeant Probert everything, from the first candle he had carried 3 years before out of a guilt he could not name even to himself, to the last one he had failed to carry 2 nights past, and he asked, at the end of it, only one thing, that whatever was done to him, it be done knowing he had kept 1 man alive that 2 other men had meant to leave for dead. Rees Morgan, when at last he was permitted near, crouched by the stretcher where Vaughan lay wrapped in his mother's shawl, and said nothing for a long moment, only looked. Vaughan's eyes opened at that, cloudy and slow to focus after so long in the dark, and found, of all the faces in that crowded yard, the one face in it that had first carried his signal 300 miles without knowing what it carried. 4 and 3, Morgan said, very quietly, and Vaughan's cracked lips moved into something that was almost, after 18 months, almost a smile. They carried him at last up the yard toward the shaft, into the yellow round of a single swinging lamp at the mouth of it, and he blinked at that small, ordinary flame as though it might burn him, a man to whom any light at all had become a kind of wonder. Chapter 9. The Cage Comes Up. They took Vaughan up to my own room above the ironmonger's, for St. Mary's was 300 miles distant, and a man in his state could not have borne the train, and I nursed him myself for the better part of a week before I judged him fit to be moved. Mrs. Pugh fed him broth on a spoon, as patiently as she had once fed a curious London doctor his supper, and asked no more questions of him than she had ever asked of me. Josiah Price was taken to Cardiff to answer for what his own company plans, once properly read against the mortar Holmes had tested, made very hard for him to deny. Isaac Ellis went with him. Evan Ellis gave his evidence exactly as he had promised, in the mud of the yard, and the court, weighing 3 years of guilt, honestly confessed against a year and a half of a life, quietly kept from ending, dealt with him, in the end, a good deal more gently than the law might have allowed. Holmes left for London on the second morning, his part in the matter finished, with only a brief word of thanks to Sergeant Probert, and a longer, quieter word to Rhys Morgan that I did not overhear and never asked him to repeat. I stayed the full week, and on the last evening I walked down with Morgan to the pithead, for the day cage was due up, and half the valley had turned out, as they do in that country, to watch a shift come home safe. We stood together at the rail, his good arm resting on it beside my own, and neither of us spoke until the wheel above us slowed and the cage broke the surface into the last of the daylight, full of tired, ordinary men, black with coal dust, calling out to their wives below. "It is a strange thing, Doctor," Morgan said at last, "to have a bad dream turn out truer than any waking thought I had. I have set down a great many cases since, some stranger and some far more dangerous than this quiet Welsh valley ever offered us. But I do not think any of them gave me, quite so simply, what that evening gave me. An old patient's hand briefly on my shoulder, a cage coming up safe into the light, and the plain, unearned knowledge that I had, for once, been some real use to a man before my cleverer friend arrived to finish the work.